I'm so glad to be with you all today, and especially glad to be with a friend of mine, Miss Deanna Croness, the creator, founder, inventor, lover of therapy of Tholage. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, of course, of course. So let's get into it. So what is the story behind creating Tholage?
Okay, so I am a certified EMDR therapist, which maybe is jumping ahead a little bit. I'm a therapist licensed in Illinois to work with clients. And I was trained at Northwestern University, and now I'm a PhD student at Northern Illinois University. And in the course of using EMDR, which your viewers may be familiar with, and also in talking to other clinicians, I found that sometimes it would really be super helpful for like a single incident trauma that occurred, maybe was onset in adulthood. So something that happened to somebody when they were an adult. But when it came to complex trauma, something that somebody went through multiple times in different ways, they just would get so stuck, Olivia, and they couldn't, EMDR wasn't quite enough. And, it's a beautiful modality. And I can actually talk a little bit about whether in simple terms or complex terms around what happens in the brain with EMDR, which we've just really learned in like the last 5 or 6 years in detail neurobiologically in any case. And I can, as I said, explain it in layman's terms, but it's very different than some other things I was beginning to notice. And I was trained psychodynamically, which means we believe in emotions. And when emotions, everyone believes in emotions, I think, but we believe that when emotions get suppressed, people end up with symptoms of mental disorders, and it can be a whole array of different types of disorders. So I just frankly kind of noticed something from my own life. Candidly, I had a family member who completed suicide, and it was one of my caregivers when I was growing up. So I understood some concepts that, say, Freud would talk about. We don't have to talk about everything Freud did, but he believed
Yeah.
that when we suppress anger, it can turn into depression. The literature shows it can turn into PTSD. It can turn into a whole bunch of other things. And I just was never feeling angry towards this person. Everybody around me was. And I started to feel stuck in PTSD was what I developed when this person died. It was violent, it was unexpected, and it caused me to, however, it caused me to notice something that when I would lift my eyes up and hold them up, I could tap into emotions that I never could usually feel. And then I would get symptomatic relief. So it set me on this journey that I began to notice other somatic things that people could do or did do, or things I would do that would help. And then I examined the literature, as we should as
Mhm.
therapists, and sort of pieced it all together why it works. And it really does work, as I think you know.
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. It does. Okay, that's cool. So that's kind of like a big flyover
Yeah.
of
Mhm.
yeah, I like that. That's cool. So drilling it down a little bit, how would you describe or explain Tholage being different from things like CBT, EMDR, ART, or just general talk therapy?
Right. Well, one of the things I set out to do was to make sure that it was very robust. In other words, it has a lot of different aspects to it, affording the therapist the opportunity to do what is needed in the moment. So, most psychotherapies, and I'll kind of generalize a little bit here, this is not entirely true for everything, but they're very focused on the calming piece of things, we call that parasympathetic. So and parasympathetic can mean two different things, but we're talking about the calming. Some people might be familiar with the term rest and digest. They
Mhm.
lean into that, which can serve some amazing purposes. But in terms of something else that we do in Tholage, we engage in something called memory reconsolidation. And what that actually means is when you learn anything, actually, it becomes sort of like a memory. But and memories are meant to change. We update memories with new information all the time. The
Mhm.
problem is with trauma, which is at the root of many mental disorders. So that's important to say. With trauma, that traumatic memory gets really, really locked in. And that's a fact. Like that's demonstrated in the neuroscience, neurochemically, and so on. And so you have to find ways to do two things. Well, actually, three. You take the memory apart, destabilize it, you change the way it feels emotionally, physically, and in your thoughts, and then you close it back up again. So when you talk about a lot of therapies that lean into calming techniques,
Mhm.
EMDR has been demonstrated to turn off that threat center. It's actually called the basolateral amygdala. It's the emotional memory center, which is a good thing. That helps to destabilize a memory and it can help with some changing, like feeling calmer when you think of the memory, but it doesn't close the memory back up in this new
Mm.
form. And
Yeah.
that's what Tholage does with this eye lift exercise. It might sound very surprising to your listeners to hear that we are purposefully turning on the sympathetic nervous system, right?
Yeah.
We're
Right.
turning on the, believe it or not, fight or flight system to close the memory back up, but we're also actually turning on that emotional memory center instead of turning it off like EMDR does. We turn it on. And what that means is if somebody really deep down has a right to be angry with someone from childhood or any emotion that's suppressed, they can tap into that. And that can be empowerment, confidence, strength, healthy anger, things that were not safe to feel in childhood. So that's why with complex trauma, this very full, robust approach is so different than some other treatments. You mentioned CBT. That's very focused, of course, on thoughts and actions, behaviors. That's something we do in Tholage with a step that's about re-narration of the trauma. But we're re-narrating while we're doing these exercises, these somatic exercises. So we're changing the way they feel in the body while we're changing the thoughts. Because one of
Mm.
the things we've learned is just to change the thoughts that go with something doesn't really change the lived experience for the person. The
Right.
physiological response that sometimes the heart beats faster or they start sweating when they think about it or when they encounter something that reminds them of the trauma. So it's really, really quite different in those respects. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. You mentioned okay, so you mentioned, like, the eye lifts,
Hmm.
um, like and I think a lot of people probably understand that, like, EMDR is like that bilateral kind of
Mostly,
side to
right?
side, right?
Quick
Whereas Tholage is doing the
reflow
eye
though.
lifts. Right, so talk to me a little bit about, like, what is happening
I love it.
neurologically, right? Like, get a little into the weeds because this is so it's so fascinating.
You know, I love to do that.
Yeah, when someone kind of does that and holds an upward eye position, kind of at that, like, 45-degree angle, like, what is happening in our brains?
So just a quick clarification, it's 60 degrees
60.
with your feet, right? So if you it is true. With EMDR, the movements are saccadic. They're fast, they're repetitive. With Tholage, the eye movement piece of it, and there are other pieces of it. So there's a somatic piece and all kinds of mentalizations and parts work. But the eye movement piece, if you were to look straight ahead, that would be 0 degrees,
Mhm.
right? If you were to look straight up, you can't, of course, and you shouldn't try.
Yeah.
Well, and actually don't try the eye lifts at home. We don't have clients use them at home. We want to be in the situation where the clinician is ready and present and it's carefully controlled and monitored. Even though we're accessing empowerment and healthy anger, it
Mhm.
is still in an activated state. So 60 degrees is about two-thirds of the way. I'll kind of demonstrate. I'll try not to look at a bright light. That's one of the instructions. And we hold it. And the literature, there is literature around it, and it tells us certain things, and I'll share what those are. I also was fortunate. We have, and we'll get into this, I know. We've done a couple clinical trials. We're on the third, but I've also been able to witness an observational neuroimaging study, and I got to see this happen with a person in an MRI machine. So what
Cool.
happens exactly, and what happens with the eye lift is when the eyes are held in an upward position for at least 10 seconds, we do it longer in Tholage. This activates a part of the brain, called the locus ceruleus. And what this is it's a very tiny structure in the brain, but it's extremely powerful. And it's the biggest producer in the brain of norepinephrine, which is an activating chemical. It's involved in a lot of different things, learning and
Mhm.
memory, but also activation. So it is involved in fight or flight, and it is involved the first time a traumatic memory forms. But now we're using it to change that memory because, as I said, with trauma, it gets locked in really hard because of this norepinephrine, and we're trying to undo that. And we actually need the norepinephrine to undo the trauma memory. Otherwise, as people know, it'll just keep going that way. So, what happens is that norepinephrine goes to the basolateral amygdala, which is what I talked about before. That is known as the emotional memory center. So when we go through a trauma and it forms and it kind of sticks, gets stuck in someone's brain, the emotional piece of the memory goes to the basolateral amygdala, and the episodic piece of the memory, or the facts of what happened, goes to the hippocampus.
Mm.
So we're acting on both of these structures with this eye movement, and it's just been super profound for people. You start and it's not a treatment designed to help people reclaim memories, but I have had a client, I think you've seen the footage of this, who went through a trauma decades and decades earlier, had 6 months of EMDR. Not that I'm trying to bash it, but it is just a different
Yeah,
mechanism in the brain.
right.
And she never could remember details of the trauma. And I wasn't going there with her. We were just addressing trauma and trying to remove the physical response. And she started to say, on her very first time doing eye lifts, you know, he's wearing this, he's wearing this, it's this color, he's got a pot belly, this, that, he did this. And, my jaw was on the ground. It really is a powerful technique. And that's what's happening neurobiologically is a lot, frankly.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think it's helpful for folks because I think a lot of times people will hear about a new trauma modality or any modality in general, and they're
Right,
like, is that too woo woo? Because the field in general has, a lot of folks see therapy sometimes as like, it's more woo woo. What is it actually doing? I'm like, no, this is actually like rooted, evidence based. Like
right.
it's rooted in actual science, and like there's things that are actually happening, which is why I wanted to make sure that we talk through some of that because like it's so powerful, and I think it's so helpful to also understand like our nervous system states and what's going on, and that can feel really empowering for folks because a lot of times people are very disconnected from their bodies for various reasons, and have no idea why something may or may not be happening.
Right.
And so yeah.
And the word you used was so perfect, empowerment, because it is empowering to put things in the hands of the clients. Most of these techniques, other than the eye lift itself, are meant for use at home as well.
Hmm.
We're very cautious with the eye lift because it is so powerful. But once people learn how to access things like empowerment, confidence, strength, healthy anger, which is not rage and is
Hmm.
not irritability, and we do differentiate those quite clearly, they can do that at home. There's another component of Tholage that's called the somatic exercise position. The name doesn't really matter, it's sort of arbitrary. But what we do is we not on every single eye lift, but on certain strategic eye lifts, because that happens more than once in a treatment, that eye position, and some questions that are asked afterwards when you bring the eyes back to the center point. We do sometimes accompany the eye lift with the somatic exercise position. And what the literature tells us is if we engage any of the large muscles of the body, the core, that it can be the glutes, it can be the quads, while we're doing the eye lift, or even without it, frankly, we're engaging in the same neurobiological process.
Hmm.
We're releasing norepinephrine. We are acting on all the same things I just described. So it enhances the sympathetic action. And one of the things I neglected to mention is when I did get to watch that research study, I did get to see some of these things. The resolution, not to be too detailed, but when you do an MRI, it depends on the resolution, what you can see. What we did see, you can't always see the amygdala because they're so small, but
Hmm.
we did see a part of the brain light up that the literature on the eye lifts, which are called up gazes in the literature, if you ever want to look it up, is that it turns on something called the ventromedial PFC, since you asked about the
Mm.
neuroscience.
Yeah.
When we see the VM, ventromedial PFC, light up, that tells us we have activated the sympathetic nervous system. There aren't other treatments out there doing this. And so, again, we're doing it under carefully controlled conditions. The eye lifts are done with a therapist, but we encourage strong, and I actually got to see the VMPFC light up. We had someone in a tube, they would lift their eyes for 10 seconds, bring their eyes back to the midpoint for 10 seconds. They did that on it back and forth for 2 minutes, and we saw the VMPFC light up and turn on every single time. So
That's
that
cool.
tells us exactly what we want. But because physical exercise also does a lot of these same things, all of these same things, we encourage it. And we encourage physical movement, whatever physical activity the person is able to engage in will help them feel their emotions more organically in the moment. We do not encourage people to try to talk to, let's say they get in touch with some healthy anger toward a caregiver or other important person, maybe from childhood in complex trauma. We don't encourage them to try to talk to them about their own emotions. It's their emotions. It's they get to feel them to relieve their symptoms. People sometimes will bring up their defense mechanisms, if I may say, and they'll start to say, my caregiver did the best they could. This important person from childhood had their own stuff. They put a roof over my head. Yes, that's all true. And you get to feel your feelings about it. You will not change them. So talking to them isn't necessarily recommended. It depends on the circumstances, right? But yeah, that's kind of the neurobiological view of what happens.
Cool. That's awesome. So, what, and again, like, you don't need to get too in the weeds here of like, what is this practically, like, what does a session look like for a client, a
Okay,
patient? What's
sure.
happening in the room?
I love that question. So, just briefly, we don't jump into a treatment in Tholage right
Hmm.
away. We have some what we call psychoeducation sessions where you're learning the different techniques. We have something I haven't even talked about yet, which is opposite in opposition to the eye lifts. It's ASMR. If people are familiar with it, that's the tingling sensation you might get if someone plays with your hair or touches your skin, depends on what's appropriate for you culturally and so on. We engage and initiate ASMR without audio, without video, without touch. So, very novel somatic exercises to deepen the relaxation, the parasympathetic state, which is involved in that whole memory process that I talked about. And we do all of this. You have to learn these exercises that you can also, you'll use them in a treatment and you'll use them at home. Then we get a little bit further down the road, and maybe we've mapped out exactly what we're going to do in a treatment. Well, that's technically what we do in what we call a planning session. So we'll have a whole session dedicated to what are we going to focus on when we do the treatment session of Tholage. And then we get to the treatment session. We do some of these things I've talked about, eye lifts, somatic exercises, ASMR, great feeling, tingly things, some re-narration, some parts work, which is kind of like a parts dialogue, like
Hmm.
talking to our past selves. It's different than internal family systems in that regard. They do parts work very differently. And then the week after that or so, at least we try to have at least 3 days pass, we meet again and we do like kind of a regular talk therapy session, but we call it a debrief. And we're going to look into like what happened for you, because probably one of the most profound aspects of Tholage is that people will come back and they'll say, I had a dream like I never had before. It was so vivid. And maybe the client may or may not see the direct relevance to what was targeted in the treatment, but the clinician, hopefully will, and will focus that, and they'll maybe have some feelings of just emotion regulation. Their symptoms will reduce. They'll feel so much better. Really engage or encourage physical movement in the days afterward, just to keep the process going and to get out all this energy, because we do believe that it can kind of be released from the body with physical engagement. Not a novel thought there, but we really do that. So that's kind of what it looks like to be treated with Tholage. And so you could pick, your therapist might pick like one representative trauma that's like part of a cluster of traumas, and then another representative trauma or incident that's part of a different cluster. and just kind of work on all the different neural pathways because we are literally rewiring the brain and we're doing it not just cognitively, we're doing it physically and emotionally as well.
Yeah, so, like, more repetition in different kind of sectors of the body, and yeah, which I think in order to create new neural pathways, the repetition of, like, it's like it's a practice of
Right.
which is why I think that you guys also recommend doing the somatic like, some of those exercises at home for more of that, like, imprinting,
Yeah.
um
Absolutely. And again, not the eye lifts at home, which the whole treatment of Tholage is designed. At one point, there's a phase where we go back and forth between an eye lift and an ASMR calming exercise. So an activating and then a deactivating. And the reason is because the deactivating takes the memory apart, then we re narrate it. And then the eye
Mhm.
lift, the activating puts the memory back together with this re narration, with this feeling of empowerment, with a calm body.
Mm,
And suddenly that's the form the memory takes. But to your point, we repeat that. So we do it more than once in the treatment session. And then, of course, they're doing ASMR at home and they're hopefully exercising, moving their body, and learning to feel their feelings more organically.
yeah. No, that makes sense. What conditions or
Mm,
people
yes.
does the Tholage work best for? And are there people or certain conditions or diagnoses that is not like right for?
Contraindicated, sure.
Right.
Well, we have done 2 clinical trials using the eye lifts and the somatic exercise position of Tholage to treat depression
Hmm.
and emotion regulation. We've tested clinical trials for PTSD, looking at frequency of symptoms, severity of symptoms, and we've also tested for just anxiety. Forgot to mention
Hmm.
that. But what we see in the therapy room, because we have quite a few clinicians trained and we've treated probably close to 1,000 people at this point, we believe we have clinicians who work on substance use disorder. They don't do it right away after somebody has gone through, the withdrawal process. There's some time that has to pass before something like that happens. But it's just really been impressive. We use it for treating eating disorders, for OCD. There are just numerous different things that it can be used for. It is for complex trauma, which is at the root of so many other things. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, are known to be at the root of so many different disorders. And so we use it for all of those things because we're treating the trauma memory and the suppression of emotions. There are some things that at this time we're contraindicating. I was just actually pulling up the list. Right now, we're contraindicating it for dissociative identity disorder. Probably in the future, that won't be the case, but right now it is. We do have a researcher lined up to do a study using Tholage for DID. Right now, we are allowing clinicians to use it for schizophrenia as long, it depends on the clinician's judgment and if it is well controlled with medication. But there are several diseases that actually you have to have the client check with their physician, their primary care physician.
Yeah.
Cushing's disease, Addison's disease, both relate to the release of cortisol, and there is a connection. That's also an activating chemical, so we have to be careful when we're releasing a lot of norepinephrine. We did candidly have someone early days. They knew they were supposed to check with their physician. The physician was out of town. The client wanted to go forward. This was not my client, but the clinician did a great job. They did move forward and they did need to give themselves an injection for it was Cushing's, I believe.
Wow.
So it really shows you how much norepinephrine is being released. Now,
Yeah.
some physicians I have talked to don't really think that an eye position is going to release that much norepinephrine, but others are really taking us very seriously and they'll tell clients, and I've seen this in action, don't lift your eyes quite as high, right?
Yeah.
We do recommend people with heart issues, blood pressure issues, asthma, and COPD to check with their primary care physician, but we've not had any issues, and it's probably unlikely that there would be, but those are the current circumstances.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's cool. What a few more questions and then we'll wrap this train
Okay.
on up. But What are you most excited about right now in terms of like the research, the clinical studies that you guys are doing for Tholage? Like what gets you super jazzed up right now?
Well, that's such a great question. Well, I have to say I'm a big research person, and
Mhm.
I was a co-investigator on the first two clinical trials. As I said, I got to observe the neuroimaging study, very unofficial, very observational, not written up. The first article is published. The second article is in submission. I'll probably write something about the observational look that we took. And now I'm the principal investigator as a PhD student on a third clinical trial. So that being said, probably I'm going to give you two answers. Probably the thing I'm most excited about truly is the outcomes. It's very moving to me when I see people say, I've been to therapy for years, I've tried everything. They seek me out when they see I'm doing something different just because they've tried so many things.
Yeah.
That's the most exciting thing. However, research does get me jazzed, and I love that we are so rooted in so much existing literature and building our own research studies. What's exciting about our third clinical trial is that we've previously only looked at the eye lifts. Now, as far as when I was talking about changing the associations with the memory, the reason the eye lifts work by themselves, and that's all we studied before, and they did work. We had large effect sizes across the
Yeah.
board. I think were you part of that study, or
Yeah.
did you?
Yeah.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah.
The
The very
second
first one? Yeah.
I think it was actually the second one. There was a small one
Okay.
before you, but yeah, I think you were
Yeah.
part of the second one, which was bigger. We had 63 participants, and you were one of them. 63 participants, you were one of the clinicians. So what we're doing, well, what happens when the eye goes up? I talked about the sympathetic nervous system goes on. I watched that happen with the
Mhm.
VNWFC lighting up. What we know is that when you shut that off kind of quickly and they bring the eyes back down to the center, to the midpoint, the body sort of compensates and says, we were just up in activation and now we're not. Let's go into the calming state. And so and it's just to like, as like homeostatic, like just to set things back to center. So we know that we're like destabilizing the memory every time the client brings their eyes back to center and then restabilizing or reconsolidating it when they lift their eyes. And we're repeating this in phase one. We repeat the eye lift it could be 6 times, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then in phase two, we do it some more with ASMR. What we've never done is said, well, we've been using ASMR too. We wanted to isolate the eye lifts, but now it's time to look at the whole thing together. And so I'm very curious to see if that extreme relaxation of ASMR, that
Mm.
tingling sensation, is going to really like even make it more powerful, like destabilize the memory even more than just simply lowering the eyes back to center. So that's what we'll be looking at in the third clinical trial. So
Cool.
I'm very excited. Yeah, that should be
Yeah.
interesting.
That's really fascinating. That's really, really cool.
We'll
Yeah.
still look at the first phase by itself to compare it to the two previous studies as a control, but then we'll add the second phase and then we'll see, is there a big difference? Is there really no difference? But we know we'll probably still find large effect sizes. So that's all I wanted to add. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's great. That's awesome. That's really, really cool. Well, thank you so much for your time and being here and teaching the people about this cool stuff. Someone who's listening and they're like, okay, yeah, I've got, so I've got some I've been suppressing emotions maybe for a long time, or, to your point of what you said earlier, I've tried a bunch of different stuff and I still feel a bit stuck.
Yes.
What is kind of the first step that someone can take to find a Tholage practitioner?
Well, we are growing. So we're in close to 30 states now. So somebody could go to our website. It's kind of a weird little spelling. It's Tholage. So it's THOLAGE.com and or Google it, I suppose. And then when you get to the website, go to the page for patients, for clients, and you'll see find a practitioner, which is our directory. Then you'll just select by state. We actually have practitioners in Canada and Italy. So we're adding other countries, and they're in the drop down too, depending on where your audience is. And so by state, of course, you'll click on it, do search, and it should bring up a list. Some states just have a couple of practitioners, some have quite a few. So hopefully you'll be able to find, and we're adding more all the time. I'm doing a lunch and learn today as we record this, and we're just adding more people all the time. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Very, very cool. Well, thanks, Dana, again for your time and for the work that you're doing. This is super exciting, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
You are a part of it. So thank
Uh,
you.
yeah, of course. All right, you guys. Well, you guys take care, and we will catch you on the next episode of A Safe Place to Land. See you later.